Hello, welcome to the Guelph Turfgrass Institute at the University of Guelph. I'm Eric Lyons, and I'm here to talk about a recently finished study on evaluating sports field overseeding with new cultivars and species that was funded by the Ontario Turfgrass Research Foundation. This study occurred over a 3-year period where we evaluated overseeding of sports fields under trafficked conditions. So we had 2 levels of traffic. We had a high traffic situation and a low traffic situation. So for traffic, we used a traffic simulator. This is a walk behind unit that has 2 barrels that turn in opposite directions as they move across the plots. And what we did is we did 2 passes a week for the light traffic and 6 passes a week for the heavy traffic. So it was literally 3 times as much. We didn't have any zero traffic treatments because that's just unrealistic for an in-use field, and that's the research we're trying to encounter. The treatments include overseeding with perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, tetraploid perennial ryegrass, fast germinating Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass with a fall overseeding of Kentucky bluegrass to see if we can maintain Kentucky bluegrass concentrations, and then also a non-overseeded control. We also overlaid a weed treatment with chelated iron. This is not something that's commonly practiced in Ontario, but it is a tool available to sports field managers if they choose to do so. We are actually, even though the project has concluded, we are still taking data because with overseeding, you're always affecting the seed bank. And so even though the project's concluded, we're going to continue to monitor this and see if we notice any differences. My lab group, almost 20 years ago, started a project with the Ontario Turfgrass Research Foundation where we looked at overseeding sports fields. And we were the first people to show that overseeding could prevent weed encroachment on sports fields. And also what we noticed was overseeding would dramatically increase ground cover and the quality of the sports fields for play. So the idea was it's been long enough. We did it with perennial ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass back then, and we only saw perennial ryegrass. There's been a lot of cultivar improvements, a lot of introduction of new species, and we thought this was time to revisit that research to see if we could find anything new. So our original hypothesis of this trial would be that there would be some differences from what we've seen in the past. In the past, we've always said that perennial ryegrass works and nothing else we tried has worked. And our hypothesis was, well, with these faster germinating Kentucky bluegrasses, with these more adapted and bred tall fescue types that would be able to be better in the situation, we thought that those grasses would start to come in and they'd be an alternative to just perennial ryegrass. We are not seeing that. In fact, in our Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass category 2 trial, we are seeing almost no tall fescue. So overseeding with tall fescue in this case did not seem to take into an existing stand that was being trafficked. Tall fescue is a great grass. It's used for a lot of different things. One of the issues with tall fescue is it takes a beating in the winters here. It doesn't die. It just really is slow to wake up. And so generally, I do not recommend tall fescue for sports fields in Ontario, but they are used. And where they're used most effectively is in areas that are more prone to drought, where you're not going to close the field as it goes dormant. So it will stay greener longer. The issue that we have is you can get on it later in the year. It's not ready to play on. So I would not recommend overseeding with tall fescue because we weren't able to see any tall fescue tillers coming into the plots previous to tall fescue overseeding. And there's issues that if it's just a tall fescue stand that I would want to avoid as a sports turf manager. So with the different species, we used different things because we had some ideas of how they would react. One of those was tetraploid perennial ryegrass. Tetraploid perennial ryegrass has essentially double the chromosome number of a regular diploid perennial ryegrass. And with tetraploid perennial ryegrass, it supposedly is much more hardy at the seedling stage. It's a slightly bigger plant with a thicker stem, which will help that plant survive in traffic. That is the hypothesis. One of the issues with tetraploid perennial ryegrass is there's really no way to tell tetraploid perennial ryegrass from regular perennial ryegrass. So species of composition was assessed in 2 ways. The first way is we assess weeds. And we did that first using a point quadrat where we would throw down a grid, and at the intersection of every grid, we would actually identify the plant that was there. And if it was a weed, it was identified of the weed and the type of the weed, or if it was grass, it was grass and non-weed. Then what we did to assess the species composition of the grass is we randomly pull on a transect method 50 tillers from each plot. So when we're done doing this, we will have identified well over 50,000 turfgrass plants. And that's where this work is very hard to do, and that's why so few people do it. What we have found was interesting. What we have seen so far is perennial ryegrass is a very good overseeding grass. It's also much more mobile than we ever thought it would be. So as we did our research here, we were very careful to slit seed the grasses in and mow only in the direction of the seeding so that there wouldn't be any cross-contamination of the plots. What we have noticed is almost all the plots have an increase in perennial ryegrass in them. Almost none of the plots see an increase in any of the other species. This result is surprising to us, but it's also in line with existing research that shows that perennial ryegrass continues to be one of the better overseeding grasses. There are some interesting differences in weeds. The higher traffic plots had much fewer weeds than the low traffic plots, which is something we observed. Different weeds will infect sports fields or will invade sports fields at a different rate. And in our traffic, we didn't have enough compaction to cause some of the compaction causing weeds from the traffic, but we did get turf disturbance, but the weeds were more affected by that traffic than the turf. So the turf filled back in and the weeds weren't there. So traffic is a good weed control if your primary weeds are things like dandelion and clover, and that's what we observed. The effects of the weed control, the chelated iron weed control, were exactly as we'd expect. These plots had quite a bit of black medic in them when we started because there wasn't a lot of traffic, and chelated iron is very effective at taking out black medic. So anywhere we sprayed the weed control, we had almost immediate weed suppression. And then in the ones where we didn't, we saw weed suppression over time with the traffic. I also want to add that this experiment was run twice on two very different root zones. The root zone behind me is categorized as a Category 2 sports field by Sports Turf Canada in their construction manual. And that means it has more than 75% sand, but less than 90% sand. In the other trial, which is in front of me that you cannot see, it was planted on a Category 3 field, which means more than 65% sand, but less than 75% sand. I also want to point out that our starting species composition was different. In trial 1, which started in the first year of the experiment, trial 1, the species composition was primarily perennial ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass. And in the secondary one, the primary species composition was Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue. So there was a difference in what we started with and a different in the root zone. So any results we see in this experiment will be able to say are pretty universal across all the different types of sports fields that we encounter here in Ontario. So if I had to make a recommendation to a sports field manager based on this research project and my previous research done in my lab, I would say continue with perennial ryegrass. Perennial ryegrass seems to be the one that we can measure an effect of and will continue to provide benefits to your operation and will be the best bang for your buck. This research would not be possible without the gracious support of the Ontario Turfgrass Research Foundation, which provided the funding necessary for the operations of the research. It also wouldn't have been possible without our industry partners, including Ontario Seed Company and DLF. This research wouldn't have been possible without the tremendous support of everyone at the Guelph Turfgrass Institute, including Dr. Katerina Jordan, our technician John Watson, Jabber Husseini, all the undergrads that worked on this project, Dr. Sarah Stricker, Peter Purvis, Sean Jordan, and Erica Gunn. Finally, I do want to thank Sports Turf Canada for their continuing support of research on sports fields and their guidance, making sure that the research we're doing is applicable to sports turf managers in Ontario.